I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. You know, white oak is a huge topic, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
No doubt. We talk about white oak often.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so important. Yeah. It's such it's such a big component of our forest here in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. You know, we are an oak hickory forest, mm-hmm. and that means at least 75% of the kind of the overstories in that oak and hickory category.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't realize that.
And white oak is the big player really across mm-hmm. the state. So mm-hmm. we're really excited to have Mr. Darren Morris with us here in a few minutes, and mm-hmm. he's going to be talking about, you know, kind of white oak in your forest, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody's got their own land out there, or many of our at least woodland owners do. Right. Have that, but he's going to be talking a little bit about what that means, and then some of the things that we can do to kind of improve, you know, white oak and its regeneration and its presence on the landscape. But folks, we're glad to have you all with us today. If you have any questions for Darren here in a little bit, you can use the chat function. If you are on YouTube, you can hit us up via email at forestry.extension@uky.edu, and we can respond that way. But again, just glad to have you all with us. Glad to be with you, Renee. It's always a wonderful opportunity to talk about, you know, woods and wildlife and, you know, and white oak. Again, just such a big thing.
And we talk, like I said, we talk about white oak a lot, but, you know, it's not only good just for bourbon, which is a huge thing, but it's also good for wildlife. They like the acorns, and there's other things that it's good for as well.
It really is. It's such a critical component of our forest, right? And as you all have heard on this show over the years, you know, there's some concerns about white oak and its longevity, right? It is such an important species for some of the reasons you mentioned, right? And we're really concerned about it being there for the long term. So that's really what the White Oak Initiative is all about, right? Trying to ensure that we have white oak for generations to come. And again, we're just excited to have Darren Morris here talking a little bit about that.
Yep. So let's go ahead and get him on. So Darren, if you would like to join us, welcome to the show. Once again, we appreciate you being with us.
Good morning.
Greetings.
Glad to be here.
So tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about today.
Well, white oak, there's a lot going on with it. It's you know, it's got a role in so many different things, not just the forests themselves, but you know, anything that enjoys the forest, which is a lot, right? So that's white oak being the center part of the wagon wheel. You know, a lot of spokes touch a lot of places that, you know, we often discuss on this show. And it's not just about trees or timber. It's about forest health, and anything that enjoys or needs those forests, really. So, you know, we're going to try to, you know, pull some of that together today and talk about that. The you know, the first thing I'll do is just sort of go over white oak in general. And today, white oak in your forest, white oaks in your forest, right? Either way. And it's white oak considerations within your family-owned forest. What you need to consider, things that you may not consider. You know, how are the white oak trees and other oaks faring out there in the forest that maybe you're not paying much attention to, or you haven't been in and looked at in a while. So this is a kind of a heat map of white oak. It's a basal area. It's a board foot map, which is the amount of stuff, the amount of white oak stuff that is out there growing in the forest. So look at Kentucky. Kentucky's well represented with white oak, especially in the eastern end of the state, and then across the central and the west end of the state. If you've been out west and walked around the woods you'll realize just that little bit of green that we're seeing out there on the map actually represents quite a lot of white oak out there in the forest. White oak it's everywhere. And, you know, it's tolerant of a wide array of conditions in the forest. So that's why we're concerned with white oak. White oak is a key species. It's a cornerstone species in management. When you do good things for white oak, you do good things for other upland oaks and forests in general, pertaining to forest health, forest diversity, invasive species, all that kind of stuff. So it's not just Kentucky. White oak has a wide range. it involves a lot of states, especially, you know, any state that's along the Mississippi River to the west, and then all the way to the eastern coast, pretty much is the range of white oak. So this is a heat map that shows the intensity a little bit better. I'll zoom in to Kentucky specifically. But notice, you know, now you can actually see those colors pop of where we have white oak out there in the forest, and where we need to make sure that we're managing in such a way that is benefits our upland oak forests here in Kentucky. Of course, eastern Kentucky, and then, you know, it sort of skirts down below the bluegrass, and then out west, there's a big representation of white oak. Of course, land between the lakes shows up very well, right? So this is a distribution of our plot data, and specifically, this is our FIA plot data, forest inventory and analysis plot data. Don't worry about the words there, showing the graphic and what it means. I'll tell you what it means and what it is. Each one of these red dots represents at least one white oak seedling per acre or within the plot. So these plots are remeasured hopefully every 5 years by foresters, by federal foresters and state foresters across the eastern United States. And each of these plots is remeasured. And every time they remeasure, they count the number of white oak seedlings, among many other things that, you know, information that they're taking in. But white oak seedlings is one of them. And if it's a blue dot, the plot had 0 white oak seedlings, none. If it's a red dot, that plot had at least one, maybe way more than one, but at least one seedling. And that provides us some information. It lets us know that far out to our west, our neighboring state, Missouri, actually not doing too bad as far as white oak regeneration. In Kentucky, it's hit or miss, right? Eastern Kentucky, there are a lot of blue dots there that represent 0 white oak seedlings in forest where there should be some. So that's a problem, because the seedlings are the ones that become the larger trees that we recruit those into our forest to become mature trees at some point, right? It takes a long time, but we have to start with the seedlings that we have. And if we don't have them, that's a big issue in white oak and upland oak management. So take a look, compare the blue to the red. The blue is not good. That means there's 0 white oaks. And that's something that we're wanting to change. We're wanting to do enough work to get enough attention to this white oak thing and upland oaks to where in 15 or 20 years down the road, when foresters are continuing to take this plot information down and gather this plot data, we change some of these blue dots to red dots. So that's the goal. And that process is going to take a while. It's a little bit here, a little bit there. And of course, it's a long-term goal for the most part. So our white oak inventory right now, we know, is increasing. The blue line that you see that's arcing up and to the right, that's our white oak inventory that's out there in the forest. Those are grade 1 through 4 logs. So those are high quality white oak trees, and those are low quality white oak trees. Everything and above all mixed together. The red line is the amount that is harvested and compared to its growth rate. So notice down at the bottom, we have years. We start with, well, let's start with 2024 where we are. 2024 is not listed, but you see 2023. And this graphic is projected for approximately 50 years based on how we know we're growing white oak in the forest and how we know we're harvesting it on a yearly average, how much is being harvested. And somewhere around the year 2055, 2058, we have a problem. We have an inventory problem. We are beginning to harvest these trees faster than we're growing them. And that's not good. So management work needs to happen so that this projected 50-year graphic can be changed. And that's what we're doing. So it's about active management and growing forests, particularly in a way that benefits oaks, upland oaks, and that we regenerate our forests, but we also recruit those trees into larger size classes. If we separate out the grade 1 logs, right now you see that the blue line is on a decline. So right now, the grade 1 trees are being harvested faster than they're growing. As you can see at the bottom, the green line, that's the amount that we harvest in Kentucky every year. That's an average. The red line is the growth of white oak, and the red line's below the green line. So we're already harvesting more than we're growing at a faster rate for the grade 1 logs. This is the grade 2 log. It's a little bit at a lesser slant, but it's still in a decline. So still with grade 2, we're growing those trees in a way where we're harvesting them faster. So we need to do more management. We need to create situations out there in the forest that turn this declining line into an inclining line so that it shows that we're growing it faster than we're harvesting. These are grade 3s. This is what you want. However, these are grade 3 and grade 4 trees. So yes, we're growing grade 3s and grade 4s faster than we're harvesting them, but that's not necessarily good for the forest, because what's a grade 3 and a grade 4 tree? Well, those are trees of lower quality. Yeah, they're possibly den trees. Maybe there's a big hole in them where wildlife can get and live and that sort of thing. But as far as a healthy forest, you don't want too much of that. So we need to create a better balance out there in the woods where we've got more grade 1s and grade 2 trees growing. So what's a grade 1? What's a grade 2? What's a grade 3? Well, here it is. A grade 1 tree is a veneer. That is a stave log. That's what you hear people talking about, stave logs. Those are ones that qualify for the bourbon industry. They qualify for grade 1 trees, qualify for furniture, flooring, that high-end, high-value stuff that we need in the markets to keep things, flowing. And that's your grade 1 tree. To the right is a grade 2. Maybe it's got more branches, it's got more knots associated with it. So that means there's less clean wood that can come out of that. However, there is some. You can pull some stave material for barrel making out of a grade 2 tree, not as much as a grade 1, but it's still there, and you have secondary markets for the other stuff. There's also furniture, flooring. It's kind of an average lumber tree. It's a construction grade tree, a tie lumber, that sort of thing. The grade tree is marginal. There are places in a grade 3, tree that may have to be cut out, knots, hollow places, things like that. However, it does have material in there for pallet making, construction grade material. And then the grade 4 and 5 are low quality trees. A lot of times, if they're active den trees, will just be left in the forest. At least, maybe 1 per acre or so to make sure that we leave those specific habitat types that we're, possibly managing for. So that's kind of what the grade, the white oak quality means. This is a growth and drain. This is the amount that we're harvesting, which is those are the graph that I showed you earlier with the slanted line. This is a different version of that. So the red line in this graph is the amount harvested every year. That's your average harvested. The blue line for grade 1, notice that it's below that. So the bar for grade 1 trees is already below the red line. The grade 2 is right there at it. Some information shows that we are actually harvesting grade 2 trees faster than we're growing those. In this case, it's really close. However, the grade 3, grade 4 trees are well above the red line, which means we are growing those at a faster rate than those are being harvested. So that's good information to have. We update this as necessary, especially every 5 to 10 years or so, to get, kind of get a reflection of the latest information on how things are being grown and harvested out there in Kentucky and beyond. So this is a map of the eastern United States, mainly the white oak range, where the white oak forests are, that shows growth and drain. The red areas are the drain. Those are areas where white oak trees are being harvested at a faster rate than they're growing. And notice that across the range of white oak, there's no particular area that has more red than other areas. In other words, it's not happening in a specific location. It's not happening in a particular state or a region. It's just everybody's got a little bit of it going on. So anywhere that's green or that light green color, white oak is growing faster than it's being harvested. However, the red shows where that's not true. It's being harvested at a faster rate. So once again, this map is another one that will be interesting to pull up the same information and do a side-by-side in another 15 to 20 years to see any changes that have been made thus far with our, white oak and upland oak management. So let's get into oak regeneration specifically. So oak regeneration, if you think about it, is a preliminary requirement for oak recruitment. Right? So that makes sense. So what's oak regeneration? Oak regeneration, those are the little ankle high, maybe, the seedlings, the 1-year-old seedlings where the acorn lands and germinates successfully, and then the following year develops into a seedling. That's oak regeneration. It's not very big, but it's still oak regeneration. Oak recruitment is where this oak regeneration is grown and developed and pulled into the next size class. So you're recruiting a 5-inch diameter sapling into the next size class, which is pole timber or pole size trees, 6 to 10 inches. So that recruitment process happens throughout the remainder of the lifespan of a forest, whereas regeneration happens, at the beginning or at the turnover of a forest in its developmental process. So here's a graphic that kind of shows that. Notice we start this graphic with large saw timber. That's kind of where it begins. That's where harvests can occur. It's not always a harvest. Sometimes it's a ice storm or a tornado or who knows what that maybe cause trees to die, mortality, light conditions to change. But what we're looking at is this particular spot right here. This is the regenerating part of a forest in its life cycle. So the graphic shows kind of the life stages of a forest and its development. This represents a healthy managed forest, but they're not always healthy and managed. Sometimes they need work, sometimes they need attention, but the forest that you're working with can fall into some part of this graphic, this chart here. So this is the point where the circle is, where forests are regenerating, right? Well, yes, but then kind of not really. It's sort of back here where you have large saw timber. And the reason that is because of how oaks regenerate and compete. And it's because the small, barely developed seedling can't compete with other trees because oaks just grow too slow. They've got different challenges. They grow in a different way through sprouting and that sort of thing. So the small seedlings can't compete. So we need to start those when the saw timber, the forest is still intact, and develop that oak regeneration into something a little bit bigger that has a better chance of competing. So hardwood regeneration, with a few exceptions, oaks are present across the entire range. Like Billy mentioned at the beginning of the show, we have oak hickory forests that are common around this part of the country. And within those oak hickory forests, we have quite a few different species that are occupying that. Oak regeneration has to compete for growing space with other species like yellow poplar, which is fast growing, maples, fast growing, beech, shade tolerant, can sit there in the understory and be happy for years and decades. Hickories are fairly shade tolerant, intermediate intolerant, and then other trees like ash, walnut, 20 or 30 more species that can be out there that are competing with our oaks out there in the forest. So understanding how hardwood forests regenerate is necessary to understand how to manage for oaks and how to favor oaks, to make sure that they don't get left behind. We don't want forests that are solely made up of oaks. We don't want that, but we do need to manage to make sure that oaks have a certain occupy a certain component within these forests, and that they're represented as they need to be healthy and diverse forests. So with white oak regeneration, we know that white oak produces good acorn crops every 2 to 3 years because it doesn't have to do any more than that. The way acorns produce, it's a lot of energy to put those out. White oak lives for a long time, hundreds of years. So why put out acorns every year when a good crop every 10 years, two times every 10 years is fine. And that's kind of what they do. They produce a good crop of acorns twice in 10 years, maybe. We call that a bumper crop, right? And during that crop, we hopefully, if the acorns are able to make good soil contact, if everything works right, we get a good crop of seedlings. And those seedlings are brand new. They don't have any kind of root system developed, and they have just a few leaves attached. So they're not able to be vigorously growing trees that can compete with a lot at this point. But what happens when we have a timber harvest, or other event like ice storm, tornado, or whatever, increases the light, and sometimes significantly on the ground level in the forest. And that intensity of light stimulates growth of stuff. If oaks are there, it stimulates the growth of the oaks. But oftentimes we have yellow poplar seed that has been sitting there for years, just waiting for a sunlight event, and boom, it takes off and it grows fast. It grows faster than oaks do. So it's not always an ideal situation to let sunlight in if forest management work has not been done ahead of time to get ready to prepare for that. So there's a rush of sprouting, seed germination, seedling growth that happens when this sunlight event occurs. White oak's not a fast grower, but yellow poplar is. Maple are pretty fast growers. Beech can grow in the shade. They tend to outcompete the white oak, and you tend to develop over the course of decades, over time, you develop these forests that have heavy mid-stories of beech and maple and other undesirable trees. So for white oak to compete with some of these trees, you have to start that opening, you have to start with white oak seedlings and saplings. Saplings are larger than seedlings that are hopefully at least 4 feet tall. In this case, as you can see in the image, plenty of leaves. The tree is vigorously growing, and it's actually ready to respond to a timber harvest in this case. Pole-sized trees less than 60 years old that are vigorous, that are chopped off at the ground level, can resprout. So oaks are big sprouters, and that's important because we need to make sure we continue to sprout, consider sprouts in oak regeneration, because that's just how they work. The top gets knocked off, they're not in a hurry, they send out a sprout, and that sprout is much faster growing than a new seedling is. And of course, we have a chart that shows that. And this is the oak regeneration potential. So notice the word potential, and it starts at the little bottom left corner with an acorn. The height there are the acorn, then you have 2 foot tall, 4 foot tall, and then towards the right, an 8 foot tall sapling of oak. So the thing about the acorn that it's funny, acorns don't work exactly like you think they may, in that an acorn planted at the time of a timber harvest has a 0 chance of becoming a mature tree in that forest. It's funny to think about, but research has shown from the U.S. Forest Service that acorns just don't work that way. Acorns germinate into small seedlings, but those small seedlings have to be developed through the right amount of sunlight, which is just a little bit, in order to be developed into large seedlings and saplings, which are 4 feet tall and larger, and then also sprouts. Then when you have a sunlight event, a timber harvest or something else, then oaks can compete. So that's kind of the point of all this with oak regeneration. It's oak regeneration needs to be developed into higher quality. So to grow large seedlings, you need a certain amount of sunlight, right? Not too much, not too little. In this case, to the right is a 14-year-old white oak seedling. It's been growing in the shade. It hasn't had enough sunlight. It needs more, but there's just too much of a mid-story, too much of a dense mid-story that's hampering the development of this tree. So this 14-year-old tree, it looks like, has about 4 leaves. It throughout the years, it has developed other little branches with buds and leaves, but it just hasn't been enough. They've died back. And if you release this tree, if this forest is harvested, this tree's done. It's not competing with anything. It's just, it's not vigorous enough. It doesn't have enough of a root system to really push that tree up towards the sun and compete with anything. So that's not good. So why do we need a certain amount of sunlight? What does that mean? Each tree has a specific amount of shade that it can tolerate. And we know this with our landscape plants. Same way, landscape plants, grass, bushes, shrubs, things that are going on are the same way. They can tolerate a certain amount of shade. So that's what this chart represents. This is an approximation of shade tolerance. On the left side, you have full sun, and on the right side, you have deep shade. So I'm not talking about clouds. Like, clouds have nothing to do with it. It has to do with the actual canopy of the forest. Are there trees above the forest floor blocking sun, or aren't there? On the right, you have a full canopy, and created underneath, you have deep shade. Notice that you've got American beech, sugar maple, a little bit to the left of that, white oak. That's kind of good, because white oak is over there. It can tolerate a little bit of shade. So if we give it just a little bit of sunlight, white oak can flourish, whereas other trees don't. So that's the amount of just right that gives us a little pocket to work with where we can develop oaks into larger regeneration trees. And notice that all the oak species, the upland oaks that are part of the White Oak Initiative, are represented on this chart. This is a intact canopy and mid-story. The canopy trees are oaks, poplar, walnut. You would expect that. But in the mid-story are shade-tolerant trees like beech, maple, hickory. And those are shading out the small, low, vigorous trees, which you want to be advanced regeneration, but it's getting no sunlight. It's deep shade. It's not happening. That's not a good situation. And we've noticed this change over the centuries, last couple hundred years, where the way we do things, the way we treat the ground, we have gone from kind of open understories to more dense understories like we see today with that maple and beech problem situation that we need to deal with. So the understory and mid-story, the beech and maples are creating conditions that are too dark for oaks. So what happens? What happens if we come in and do a timber harvest? What if we harvest the trees on top, the oaks, the poplar, and the walnut? What's taken over? Well, it's going to be the beech, the maple, and the hickory, right? The ones that are underneath it. So harvesting the overstory trees or a clear cut, whatever you do, we know that the beech, maple, and hickory are going to take their place. So we have certain practices. In this case, maybe a mid-story removal. You remove that mid-story prior to the harvest. Now all of a sudden you have a stand that has adequate oak regeneration because you've developed that a little bit. You keep the top on, but you give it a little bit of sunlight underneath, develop that oak regeneration into advanced regeneration that can fend for itself, the 4 foot tall, 6 foot tall, the sprouts, potential sprouts that can actually compete. So here's the oak management practices that are designed to make good things happen, right? This little bracket area right here, this is where regeneration happens. And yeah, I put part of the bracket on the right side to encompass small saw timber. Because white oak can sprout at 65 years old, you can have an 8-inch diameter white oak tree. And if you cut it off at the stump, it's got a decent chance of resprouting. So we included a little bit of the small saw timber area because you can start considering regeneration during that time frame of a forest. So this is the regeneration, establishment, and development part of the forest. Practices that go along with that are underplanting, enhancement planting, where there aren't enough oaks. So you can just go in and plant them to get enough oaks there instantly. Then you develop those into larger seedlings. Soil scarification is a practice where you go in and scratch around on the soil, where you have deep leaf litter. Prescribed fire sometimes is involved in this process. And the goal is to just get the acorns to germinate, just to create small yearling seedlings so that you can take those and develop those into advanced regeneration. And then, of course, mid-story removal practice, where the mid-story is removed in order to benefit the oak seedlings that are already there in the understory. The next little bracket area is a regeneration release. So this is the area where you release the regeneration. Think sunlight. So if there's any kind of top left over the trees in this forest, you get rid of that, right? And excuse me, by doing so, you release this oak regeneration and it can begin to grow and outcompete some of its neighbors. This part of the process, this is when recruitment comes into play. You're actually recruiting these trees into the next size class. So 1 to 6 inch trees in diameter, by doing active management, maybe crop tree release, you're recruiting into the pole size diameter class. Same thing with the pole size diameter class. You recruit those trees by doing management into the small saw timber size. So, each process, once regeneration has been successfully done, you have to continue with oak management to continue that recruitment, because oaks can still get out competed, because we still at this point, beginning with this bracket, we have decades to go. And crop tree release can actually be done throughout decades of the growth of a forest, 60, 80 years, 100 years process of growing this forest. You're actively involved in recruitment of these trees to make sure that they're continually getting larger and larger as they grow in development. So recruitment continues, and it continues all the way up until you have large saw timber once again, when the regeneration process starts over. It's kind of it's a dynamic thing that happens. All this is happening, but it happens differently over different quality sites. Low quality sites, you don't have as much competition. If it's a lower quality site, not as much stuff is growing fast and competing to be there. So you tend to have better presence of oaks in the understory. You have good regeneration, and thus you have more often you see pole-sized oaks in a situation that you can go into and manage and make things better. Medium quality sites, a little bit better quality. You have more dense mid-stories. You have limited pole-size oaks, some, but they're limited. And then you have also limited regeneration. There's some, but you're starting to get that maple beech hickory problem. These are the northwest, southeast facing slopes, whereas the high quality sites are the northeast facing slopes. They don't get a lot of sun. They're not dried out. So they retain that moisture, which is good for, you see that dense understory, the ferns, things like that are growing there. Bottomlands are part of this. And oak regeneration is very tough. So this is where you sort of roll up your sleeves and realize you're going to need to do management work, but your result, you may be happy with just having developed a handful or less oaks per acre. Instead of an oak dominated forest, as long as you have 1 or 2 white oaks per acre in forests like this, you've done pretty well. So that's kind of the mindset that goes into it. All in all, you need to basically, realize that just because you have forests out there growing on the other side of the cornfield and the beans, doesn't mean that it's growing well. It doesn't mean that you couldn't give it some attention and a little bit of management work and, vastly improve things as far as the quality and the value of that forest. And of course, as you can see, oaks are well represented. This is white oak. Everywhere there's white oak, there are a handful of other oak species that are growing right alongside it that need active management in order to compete and grow in our forests.
I kept clicking and it wasn't going on. Thank you, Darren. We appreciate that presentation. We really do. It is, very vast amount of information.
Oh yeah, you distilled it down well, though. I do appreciate it. We did have a couple of quick questions in the chat pod.
Let's see. Said you mentioned doing a mid-store removal prior to harvest. Could you have a similar positive effect with a mid-store removal after a harvest?
Yes. So think about it. After the harvest, so what's in the upper level? So let's assume that the question means it's not a clear cut and there are some trees left. A lot of times we'll go in and we do that. The dynamics change a little bit. Sometimes the name changes and the actual practice that you would enroll in if you were to get cost assistance through an EQIP, an environmental quality incentive program, through your NRCS office, the name may change. So depending on how many years after the harvest, it may become a site preparation for regeneration, right? So same practice, you're removing something that is over the top of your regeneration in order to release it. So it's not necessarily, it's usually easier if you catch it before harvesting, but you can do it after the fact and do it successfully.
We have another question as well, is when you perform a a mid-story removal, do you remove 100% of the beech and maple or 66%, or does mid-story removal target 6-inch DBH or smaller? So they're kind of curious about that.
Yeah. So you're kind of all over it. You could remove 12 to 14-inch diameter stuff. If you've got a heavy, heavy black gum tree, in your forest, well, maybe 1 per acre will do you. Same thing with beech. If you want to leave a beech tree per acre for wildlife purposes, that's commonly done. So, normally it's just kind of it's the cards you're dealt. It depends on the size of that mid-story and then also the species component of that mid-story. If you've got a mid-story that's dominated by 10 to 12-inch trees, but those trees are hickory trees and those happen to be undesirable in your forest, then all of a sudden you're talking about maybe removing that component with that size of tree. A mid-story removal could be a commercial thing. You could, if you've got the right markets within a 20-mile radius or 50 miles, then maybe all of a sudden you could actually have those removed, make a little bit of money, not a lot, but enough to fund the practice. So mid-stories, it's diverse. And it could be involved, anything from 1-2 inches diameter up to 12, 14, and it's 16 inches.
Yeah, I guess each site's just so variable, and the conditions you're doing.
Right. And if you want to leave certain den trees, certain beech trees, 1 or 2 per acre, that's certainly something that fits in with management.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it looks like we had another question looking about, had some basically hay ground and on hills and floodplain, and they're interested in maybe trying to get white oak seedlings to plant on that. You got any thoughts or advice on that?
Yeah. So the first thing, go ahead and check your soil type. Make sure that, because you may not have the same soil type across that ground. It's as the hill goes up and down, your drainage changes. As your drainage changes, the underlying soil conditions change, and you have a completely different named soil that the NRCS office can help you with. So you identify those soils that you have out there on your property, and each soil can grow different species of trees. So you may not have northern red oak suitable for everywhere, but it may be suitable for a portion, and then white oak and, other oaks can be mixed in. So that's why it's important to just not plant, one particular species. I would suggest mixing white oak in with a variety of other trees that are suitable for the soil type. And that, it's that's also the type of thing that can, the cost can be reimbursed through government programs.
Darren, I was going to say that brings up, a really interesting thought on all of these questions. They could really benefit from working with a professional forester, right? Because the conditions are so variable, right, as you just described right there. And you don't we want to save people time and money and frustration, right?
Right.
And if they start on some of this stuff and they don't really have all the information, then they may not get the results they want. So I would really encourage anybody that's looking to do some land management, forest management activities, to consult with a forester, right? They're trained in that, and that's their job. The EQIP, the NRCS, Environmental Quality Incentives Program that Darren mentioned, the foresters can help you navigate that, and that's an important thing. That process, and I guess the other comment I wanted to mention, Darren, is getting oak back on the landscape or retaining oak. It's not a one-time event, right? It's a process, and we have to really think of it as a process, a series of steps, and not just an event.
Right. Yeah. And they, believe it or not, as slow as forests seem to grow, sometimes they'll surprise you.
Yeah.
If it's been a while, you get out there and you realize, man, things aren't growing like I thought they would. And what's all this stuff over here that's taken over? And so who knows what's going on?
Right.
You can, we provide enough information where landowners can, certainly, get out there and learn sort of how to begin this process. But before you go too far, definitely, it's a good idea to contact somebody, a professional forest manager, to help you sort of go from there.
Right.
Once you realize your potential.
Sure.
Speaking of information, you have a lot of fact sheets and information out on this kind of all these topics, correct?
We've got the Landowners for Oaks series. I think that's what you're talking about.
It is.
So are you seeing that?
Yes.
So the Landowners for Oak series was put together just for that reason, because there's a lot going on with oaks. There's a lot going on with oak management. One of the things is, why is it such a big deal? Why do we care? And so the goal is to inform landowners of all the information that we have about white oak and other upland oaks within the Landowners for Oak series. It addresses specifically 8 different upland oaks. White oak is one of those. But it's made to inform landowners of the reason why we're singling out white oak, which, I've kind of gone over. I think you get that at this point. So, its importance in family-owned forests, its importance as a keystone species with other upland oaks. Why are we giving it so much attention, which we are, and what's the active management? So I'll kind of go over that with you. I'm not, the point of this right now is not to teach anything about oaks, upland oaks, oak management or anything. It's just to inform you about this Landowner for Oak series, which can really be used if you're involved in doing any kind of education activity, field days, workshops, things like that. The Landowners for Oak series can often be a part of that. It's got some good information that can be referenced that sort of, maybe helps pull together some of your other conversations. So, white oak, of course, we have 8 upland oaks. White oak is one of them, right? Within this Landowners for Oak series, each one of them has a map that shows its range. And for white oak, we've noticed on many different occasions that the white oak range is so vast that it actually encompasses pretty much the range of all the other 7 upland oaks. So when we manage for white oak, that's one way that we're managing for all the other 7, because they grow right there with it. So each of the upland oak series has a range map, that shows the range of that particular species. We do these for 8 of them. They have different characteristics. For instance, we like to, we wanted to make sure that we showcased kind of some management, some identification tricks that maybe aren't talked about or shown. And one of them is the way white oak with the deep lobes The white oak leaves against the skylight, if you look up through the canopy of a tree that's maybe too tall to grab a leaf from, but you can look up through with or without binoculars, and you can see those finger-like lobes that are really distinct, and it can help you identify that as a white oak without going much further, right? Same thing with the bark. So the bark of white oak is distinct, has two different types, two different patterns, flaky pattern, and then kind of a smoother pattern. The smoother pattern can be confused with post oak, for instance, but it doesn't have to, because, you know, in the Landowners for Oak series, we point out that, you know, white oak will always have that flaky bark pattern, at least up in the branches, if it's not on the trunk. So it's not always on the main trunk or the first log, but if you look higher up into the canopy, you always see that flaky bark pattern on the branches. And with post oak, you never do. So it kind of, these Landowners for Oaks help distinguish between the upland oaks, which can be confusing. Of course, we've brought in the shade tolerance graphic that I showed earlier with each one of the species. You can see how it fits in shade tolerance. They're not all the same. It's, you know, sometimes it's more complicated than it seems. You know, look where chinkapin oak is somewhere in the middle. Actually, chinkapin oak starts out as a seedling, more shade tolerant. It's really closer to white oak in shade tolerance when it's a seedling, but then as it grows and develops, as it's recruited into the stand, it tends to, we think it loses that shade tolerance, and it becomes more intermediate than white oak is. So, you know, little things like that are pointed out within this Landowners for Oak series. You know, interesting things like, you know, a tree's specific uses. In the case of white oak, you know, it's important to understand that 500 species of butterfly moth larvae need white oak, and once you have that, then there goes, you know, your food chain, because that supports birds, cerulean warblers, and of course vast populations of wildlife. With black oak, an identifying characteristic, because black oak can be confused with other species, Quercus velutina, the velutina, that's the little tufts of downy hairs on the undersides of the leaves. So if you know that, and if you're trying to decide, well, is it a black oak or northern red or something, turn the leaf over, you know, look at these hairs, because they're there. You can see them with a hand lens or without. Actually, you can even feel them with your fingertips. So, you know, it's an important distinguishing characteristic, because it's kind of easy to say, you know, well, that's an oak tree. But once you get to that point, you know, unless you're in the, you know, if you know you're in the bottoms of the uplands, then you can start narrowing it down.
So neat little tips on how to identify each kind of oak that there are.
Right. And there are a lot of little nuances and things to look for. You know, ski slope tracks in northern red oak, you know, things that aren't necessarily commonly put in a tree identification book or chart or whatever. Yeah. So black oak's confused with northern red, sometimes scarlet. It grows right along there with them, you know, so you have those trees intermingling amongst one another. The black oak leaf, if you can get it, turn it over, check for little tufts of hairs. Post oak, same thing, often has that cross-like appearance to the leaf. You know, post oak can be confused with white oak. It can be confused with overcup oak. But once you start seeing a number of leaves that have that cross-like appearance, well, then you can narrow it down to post oak, you know, without going much farther. And then, you know, take a look at the bark, you know, check that, compare it with whether or not you think it's white oak, and you've got it identified. So post oak looks similar to The bark, okay, the bark of post oak looks similar to white oak, but then like I mentioned earlier, post oak bark never has that flaky, that shingles overlapping flaky bark appearance that white oak does. Post oak never has it anywhere, up in the branches, nowhere. So, that's a good way to separate the two out if it's getting confusing. The understanding the importance of white oak, that's the first one that we put together. The first things we did that I talked about were the 8 upland oaks that we have out there we're managing for, identifying characteristics of each, 3-page little publications of each one. So this next little series, the first one is understanding the importance of white oak. And it's just kind of an all-inclusive, what's up with white oak? What's the big deal? Why is it getting a lot of attention? It's got a good introduction to white oak. Well, I'll tell you why, because white oaks, it's got a huge range. It lives for hundreds of years. Everybody grew up knowing or remembering some white oak somewhere that was a landmark tree. It's often considered a cultural, historic landmark because of its age and because it's tough. It can handle drought. It stays, it stays there living for a long time. So it's one that we see. It's out there in front of us and we know it. So that's a little bit of an introduction to why we're putting all this value on white oak that's not just lumber. And of course, white oak, how it regenerates. We've got to get into that a little bit with the understanding the importance with this particular one. We don't go too deep. It's just kind of an introduction to, yes, white oak has a regeneration challenge. And here's why. It grows slow. It produces fewer acorns, all the above, right? So deal with that. We have a way, but it's something that you have to know about. And, another thing is this seedling, just because you have this little seedling out there in the forest floor, doesn't mean it's going to be successful after a timber harvest. And we know now that it's not. We've got to spend 3 to 5 years providing just enough sunlight to coax this little guy into a waist high, chest high seedling so that, then it can compete. So that brings us to the challenges of upland oak regeneration. Of course, we've got this. This is a good little graphic because it shows acorns. They don't directly become the mature tree of the next forest. The first thing they do is germinate, and then they sit there and have to become advanced regeneration. And we know that it's a process. They've got to get to the next stage. So, we've done a regeneration publication that highlights the best chance of successfully regenerating a forest and what you have to have developed there in the understory. Acorn production, white oaks are going to produce in about 20 to 25 years. But then think, how big is a 20 to 25-year-old white oak? So that first year, you're getting like 7 acorns or something. But your crown's not very big. So even though it's 20 to 25 years, that doesn't mean you have acorns everywhere. You're just getting a very few. And it really takes 75 years or so to start developing, dozens of pounds whenever you get a bumper crop. And eventually acorns can produce, but white oaks can produce hundreds of pounds, in one crop. Takes a while. Regeneration, let's see. Oak regeneration management. So this is the part where we know the shade tolerance. We know a harvest is going to happen, or maybe a harvest is not going to happen, and we just want to have a healthy forest in case we get insect or disease or an ice storm or something that knocks some of the branches or some trees out of the forest. We've got that regeneration ready to go. Because it doesn't care what releases it, and it's going to have to compete with invasives, other things that are out there, regardless of whether it was harvested or it was an ice storm or a tornado. the tornado or whatever. So regeneration management is a big focus. And how the knowledge and understanding of all of these characteristics sort of go into successfully regenerating your forests. We got into it just a little bit. The individual practices, the mid-story removal, for instance, soil scarification, right? So this kind of highlights them. The actual practices themselves, we have 9 of them that we've got with the White Oak Initiative that we sort of showcase, not including a tree planting or afforestation. And those are 10 to 20 page. They're technical. They're made for foresters or forest managers. So this kind of gives you a paragraph, 2-paragraph introduction. You know, what's enhancement planting? Well, it's also called enrichment planting, maybe underplanting. You could even use acorns to sprinkle them out to get them to germinate, to create advanced regeneration. May take 3 to 5 years, but that's the goal. Mid-story removal, we've gone over that. That's where you have a dense mid-story that's hampering the development of oaks that are already in the understory. They just need a little bit more sunlight. And of course, your harvesting practices, which, you know, there's a good way to harvest that involves focus on regeneration. And, you know, we go into that a little bit, talk about, you know, what they are and how they may be able to fit, you know, especially if you don't want to just clear cut and help solve a regeneration problem. So, and of course, this is the one I showed earlier. This shows the kind of the life cycle, if you will, of a forest. And underneath it, each of the 9 oak practices, and the gray area sort of shows a timeline of events and where each one of these fits, because you can't just do any of these in any forest. It's got to be in the right growth period, so to speak. And some of those overlap. But this sort of shows that, and it's an important thing to make sure that everybody understands. So, you know, that's, I think with everything these landowners for oaks offer, they're good if you're doing any kind of a educational activity, workshops. You know, we take these, we provide those every time we do it. But if you're doing the same, if you're involved in that, you know, go in and grab them, use them, print them out, hand them out, talk about them, don't talk about them, just provide them as information, whatever. You can grab those from the whiteoakinitiative.org website, or we have those on our White Oak publications or our Forestry and Natural Resources UK extension website of publications as well.
If you go to ukforestry.org, there'd be a publications link on there, and you just click publications, and then you can actually find that Landowners for Oak series. So I know we are out of time. Yeah. We will get to your questions after the show if you want to stick around. But Darren, thank you so much I appreciate it. It was excellent. Yep. what you showed us today. And you know, we're looking forward to maybe getting you on again and talking in depth a little bit more about some of these practices.
Sure. Yeah. Anytime. Thanks.
Yeah. Appreciate you very much.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of good information.
Good content.
Good content. Yeah. Really appreciate you all joining us every week. We can't do this without you.
That's right. And we do it for you. So I appreciate y'all being part of it. And again, if there's something you'd like to see on one of the shows in the future, hit us up on our website at fromthewoodstoday.com. And we've got a little link you can get to there for a little survey. But we appreciate y'all being with us.
Definitely. Until then, we'll see you next week.
All right.
Take care.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Today.